Wolves and Mexican footballer Raul Jimenez is in the hospital after sustaining a skull fracture from this nasty head clash this past weekend in the Premier League. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. In this video, we're going to talk about Jimenez's skull fracture sustained this past weekend, and then briefly touch on just concussions in general in professional football. As always, if you enjoy learning about this unique side of sports, please consider subscribing and be sure and follow me over on Twitter for more real-time updates and analysis, and let's get started. Now, everything about this play is set up for Jimenez to really get the worst into this collision. Luiz is coming in, he's got his head down almost a little bit pointed forward at the goal. His momentum is carrying him inward. He started off on this full run practically, so he's got a lot of additional momentum coming into this injury, as opposed to Jimenez being a little bit more standstill. If we look at the photo here, we can see exactly when this collision occurred and where the contact was to the right side of Jimenez's head. Again here, Luiz kind of had his head down, he was coming in forward, as opposed to Jimenez almost going straight up, and so really set him up to have the more severe kind of brunt of this momentum and energy transferred to him in this collision. Now, like we said, Jimenez suffered a skull fracture. So let's take a look at the different bones of the skull to talk about what could be going on here and some of the key things the medical staff have to consider with a head injury like this. So here we're looking at the right side of a skull, and while it seems like our skull is connected to just one bone, there's actually multiple bones that essentially fuse together during our development, but start off and are still considered individual bones. The prominence that you feel on the up kind of outside of your cheek, that's your zygomatic bone. This bone here on the front makes sense, it's the frontal bone. The one here on the side is the parietal bone. This guy down here is the temporal bone. And then kind of deep inside here, we have the sphenoid bone. Now, if we go all the way to the back, now we have the occipital bone. And what you can see here is there's all these different kind of lines. We call these suture lines, where whenever we're developing, initially those bones of the skull aren't fused, but then as we develop, they come together and they fuse together to form these various suture lines. I'm gonna throw the ear on here because I want you guys to kind of get a sense of some different landmarks here relative to what we see on the surface anatomy. So here's our ear sitting, you can tell, kind of right in the middle of that temporal bone. There's a specific kind of landmark here behind the ear that we call the mastoid process. This is the bump that you can feel just behind your ear. It's where the sternocleidomastoid muscle originates, and that's gonna be this little point here on the back of the temporal bone. So if we look back now at the photo of where this head clash occurred, we can see it's kind of on this right side of the skull. It's kind of near this area of the parietal bone, the frontal, the temporal bone here a little bit, kind of just above and in front of Jimenez's ear. You can really have fractures of any of these associated bones about the skull, about the face, and even kind of these orbital bones deep inside the eye socket. Now, the reports don't exactly say if the surgery was to fix the skull fracture or if the surgery was to address something else associated with the skull fracture, like a bleed in the brain, which can be just as severe of an injury. What we're looking at here are the different layers as we start at the skin and go all the way down to the brain tissue, and depending on where there's possible bleeding around the brain, we have different types of injury patterns. If we start up here first, we have the skin. Beneath the skin, we have the periosteum, which is the outer layer of the skull. We then have the bone of the skull. We then have this layer called the dura mater. Beneath that, we have the arachnoid mater, and then you have your space in between here where all your CSF production happens. There's some veins, there's some arteries in this region. This is the subarachnoid space, and then you get down to your brain tissue itself. The first type of brain bleed is something called an epidural hematoma. This occurs when there's blood, epi, or outside of the dura. So that means that the blood is somewhere between the skull and this dura layer beneath the skull. There is one specific type of injury pattern and specific blood vessel that we often worry about with epidural hematomas, and it's right around this area where Jimenez was hit. It's a blood vessel called the middle meningeal artery, and it travels just beneath an area of the skull called the pterion. This is that blood vessel that I have highlighted here, and you can see it pass up right around here where the sphenoid bone meets up with the frontal bone. And if we put the rest of our skull bones back on here, you can see the junction of all those four bones. So the pterion is this region right here. It's the junction between the parietal bone, the frontal, the temporal, and the sphenoid. And again, just beneath that junction is where we find that middle meningeal artery. So not saying at all that's what Jimenez had here, but when we see an injury like this to that location of the skull, this is one of the things doctors have to think about. The next type of brain bleed is something called a subdural hematoma, meaning the blood is beneath the dura as opposed to epi or outside of it. So now that means that the blood is down here in this space, sub or below the dura. This usually occurs when somebody has tearing of these veins that we call them bridging veins that run across the brain. Those veins tear, blood collects in this subdural space. Typically see it after falls in the elderly population, pretty common. Then of course we think about subarachnoid hemorrhaging, which is when the blood is actually deep inside the tissue of the brain itself, so to speak. So oftentimes when they're doing these initial head CTs, they're looking for the skull injuries with fractures, but they're primarily looking for brain bleeds. If somebody has a brain bleed that's severe enough, you have to have surgery to fix it. So we don't know exactly if Jimenez had like a plate put on for a skull fracture or if the surgery was more to address underlying bleeding. Either way, still a very severe injury, and this is why they're monitoring in the hospital, because of these severe types of things that can develop with this bad of a head injury. Now, finally, to address this whole just concussion management that's going on right now with professional football, I of course am a huge proponent of having concussion substitutes. Rule number one when we're evaluating for a concussion with an athlete on the sideline is you need to do it in a quiet, calm, controlled space. Now I know there's no fans here, but you don't want to be rushed, you don't want to be pressured, you want to get that athlete out of the game to do your proper assessment. You can't properly evaluate somebody for a concussion in 30 seconds or a minute. It takes more time than that to really do a good, thorough assessment. I don't understand why football is not implementing concussion substitutes today. There is no reason in my mind that it's not being implemented today. You substitute someone in, you take the guy off, you take him to a medical tent, you do your proper evaluation. Then if you decide that there's not been a concussion and they're cleared to return, take that sub off, put him back in, and everybody's protected and kept safe. Now, of course, Arsenal has said that Luiz was not unconscious, that he passed the concussion protocols, and they claim they did everything correct. Of course, he came out at halftime. They say it's because of the bleed and he was uncomfortable, whatever. None of that is really the main point. The main point is that there should be concussion substitutes. There needs to be better efforts to keep these players safe and properly evaluate them when there's concern of a head injury. I think professional football is absolutely falling behind the rest of the major sports leagues when it comes to particularly on-the-field assessment and evaluations of concussions. Implementing the concussion substitute should be done today. There should be no more questions asked, no debate, no trial period, no test period. Do it for the player's safety, do it for their health, and make the change now. Now, it's impossible to give any sort of prediction about Jimenez's return to the soccer pitch just because we don't know, was this a bone fracture that was surgically repaired? Was there a brain bleed? We have no real sense of just how severe these injuries were because that's ultimately what's going to determine him coming back. But that's it for the video, everybody. Thank you as always for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and were able to learn something. Let me know any questions or comments down below. And until next time, I'll see you later. Bye.